Ken Stein here, President of the Center for Israel Education. This is a session that's a composite of a long time work on my part and that of research assistants like Eli Sperling and Michelle Friesman, Jacob Sack, many others who have worked with us at the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel and the Center for Israel Education. How did the Zionists, the British, and the Arabs get along? What was their interaction? What was the social economic condition like from the 1860s and 70s forward? And how did a Jewish state evolve? How did it go from 24,000 Jews in 1882 to 660,000 Jews in May of 1948? When I started my work, I had no notion of the sources. I had no notion that I would even be doing the topic. And this was 45, 47 years ago. The social history of the mandate has always intrigued me. By the mandate, I mean the period from 1920 to 1948. And if we're using the terms new Yeshuv, the new Jewish settlement, we're using the terms basically from the 1880s until 1948. So however you want to categorize it, whether it's the British in Palestine or it's the very earliest Zionist tricklings into Palestine, Eretz Israel, I don't care how you term it. What I was interested in finding was what were the socioeconomic, political causes that unfolded this reality? It wasn't just the British, and it wasn't just the statements of intent like the Balfour Declaration or the League of Nations or the United Nations Partition Plan. It was how people interacted. And what I did over a period of time is I collected from a variety of Arabic, Hebrew, German, and English sources important concepts, important ideas, and I squeezed them together into this text document. So I want the participants and those viewing this to see what the Ottoman Empire looked like at the end of the 1800s and take a look at specifically what Palestine looked like at that same period of time. The key feature, of course, is that there were no states yet carved out in the Ottoman Empire. That would only occur as a result of the British and the French being victorious in World War I, and they then came to the region and created trusteeships or mandates where they controlled for a period of time the direction of the indigenous population. Both of these maps, by the way, are available on our website. And this is what 1967 looks like. This is what the period after the 67 war is all about. And what we don't have here is a Palestinian Arab entity, and many reasons why that didn't happen, many reasons why it didn't happen after the 1948 war, many reasons why it didn't happen in this 15th, 16th, and 17th century, but that's not my focus for the moment. My focus is on the timeline for Zionism in Israel. Now, some of you may say, oh, what about the Palestinian Arab narrative? What about the Palestinian Arab story? What about the Palestinians? What happened to them? My focus this evening is not about the evolution of the conflict. My focus this evening is, how did a Jewish state come into being? If I wanted to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I would have titled tonight's presentation thus. But instead, I'm focusing specifically on the timeline for Zionism in Israel and how did the Zionists make the state. So I'm going to give you 5 bullet points. We're going to do it slowly so you can grasp them. There are going to be 5 major words in the 5 major lines. Before the 1840s is peoplehood. Next, Zionism's crystallization, the 1840s to 1922. Slow down, Michelle, just a minute. Economically impoverished, the Ottoman Empire was not a place that was worthy of populations that made lots of money or that even eked out a standard of living that was bare subsistence. Zionism crystallizes at a moment when the Ottoman Empire is undergoing massive change. It's not just that the Balfour Declaration and the Palestine Mandate are at the end of the period. They could not have come at the end of the period had the Ottoman Empire already been set in by impoverishment and indebtedness of the indigenous population. What I'm trying to say is the following. Zionism in Eretz Yisrael was in a particular state when the Jews decided to move in small numbers from Europe. The Zionists could not have done it if they'd come to Chicago or Boston or Washington or South Africa or Buenos Aires. That was already well advanced and already politically and administratively efficient. The period from 1922 to 1948 is when the Zionists develop autonomy without sovereignty. Their infrastructure evolves, the people in the land are linked, and the Arab community weakens. This is all by way of saying, as the Zionist community increased in its strength, and very, very slowly in its numbers, the Arab community of Palestine did not improve itself economically. In fact, it worsened, in part because of natural disaster, and in part because of decisions what the Arab leadership made themselves. The period from 48 to 79, we're not going to deal with that today. That's sovereignty without recognition. That's from the Declaration of the State until 1979, when Egypt and Israel sign a treaty. And the last one, Michelle, is 79 to the present, when Israel still remains unfinished and it's still only partially accepted by its neighbors. What I wanted to do for the attendees and for those listening is to put this period of time of the 1840s to 1948 in a sandwich between what happened before and what happened afterwards. And it's the context that matters to me. And I think it's the context that will matter to students as they learn the story. So we want to answer the following question tonight. The following question is, what happened between 1882 and 1949? What turned Zionism from an idea into a reality? How did the Jewish population increase? We know it was immigration, but how did that actually take place? And so I want to try and answer these 2 questions and then take a look at the text study sheet to obtain some of the answers. And it's the text study sheet that I spoke to you about at the outset. The text and the sources, which I accumulated over time, which will enable us to tell the story. So if you would be so kind as to look at this discussion question. Michelle, please. What reasons would you give for how, not why, the state of Israel was created? What made state building possible from the late 1800s through 1949? Think of all the possible factors and consider Jewish, Arab, British, regional, economic, and international elements. As you jot down these points, I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes. Think about areas of focus that you might not have learned about when you might have learned the story about how the state of Israel evolved. Let's stay focused on how they did it, not necessarily why. The anti-Semitism part we've got. I understand that motivation. I would like to know, how did they actually go from Jaffa to the Ganya, to the Jewish Agency, to the Haganah, to the Palmach, to the Irgun, to an industrial infrastructure? So in the chat, many of you gave examples or reasons that focused on what happened in Europe. Rising nationalism, revolutions, socialist ideals, even the pioneering spirit of the Zionists, a lack of concern about Arab nationalism till after World War I, Enlightenment, European Jews. What many of you enumerated at the outset was the motivation to leave Europe, or the motivation to coalesce into a national ideal, or to say that we Jews had to take destiny into our own hands. We could no longer leave it in the hands of others. Haskalah, certainly, but that didn't succeed. Then there's a focal point on land purchase in Palestine. I'll get back to that. Wealthy Jews, again, external sources having an impact on what happened locally. Not walking with the Messiah, that's a motivation. World focus in other areas, response to Dreyfus Affair, flaring pogroms, revival of Hebrew. Those are excellent examples. Primarily, they focus on what happened outside. Land purchase happened inside, of course. Now the focal point for me is the motivation. And in the first 3 paragraphs of the text study, we're focused on important ideas and concepts. Michelle, if you could just scroll down ever so slightly, so I still have one at the top. Right there. So we have 2, 3, and 4 in the text study. Essentially, Zionist ideologues, philosophers. You can add Sirkin, you can add Ber Borochoff, you can add Ruvine Alkali, you can add a whole slew of Zionist thinkers who crystallized the notion together that maybe Jews should have a place of their own, and they all came up with really what was essential, different ideas on how to do that. And Herzl gathered them together, as we know, in 1897 at the First Zionist Congress. The collective was, we're not quite certain what it is how we're going to create what we're going to create, but we want to create it. And there were very few numbers of them who did it. You only went from 24,000 to 65,000 from 1882 until 1917. And indeed, there were wealthy Zionists or wealthy Jews, maybe they weren't even Zionists yet, who decided that they wanted to fund pioneering experiences. But we also learned from those pioneering experiences that many Jews who came from the 1880s until 1917 couldn't hack it. Maybe 17 to 20% actually, after they immigrated, they decided to leave. The first paragraph is forming a nucleus for a Jewish state. That will enumerate for any teacher in 20 maps and 13 pages of prose of how the Zionists connected the people to the land. And they'll show you how the settlements grew slowly and how the Aliyot interacted with land acquisition and with British policies. It's a period of time of fully 70 years. And what I've tried to do in this teaching tool is to give to the teacher and to the learner and to the adult and to anyone who's interested to see the progression on how it took place. And for those of you who are interested, this particular document, this particular resource, Forming a Nucleus for a Jewish State, can be found on our website in Spanish, and it also can be found in Hebrew. So if some of you want to teach this history using the Hebrew document for those students who are Hebrew fluent in maybe 16, 17 or 18 years old, you can do that. Or you want to teach it to them in Spanish, it's on the website as well, both under Spanish materials and Hebrew materials. Stop right there. Now here we have the critical documents, the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate for Palestine. I'm not going to dwell with the Balfour Declaration with you. Most of you know all about it. Most of you know that the Balfour Declaration contents were put into the Mandate for Palestine. And the reason that's important is because the Balfour Declaration receives legitimacy from an international organization, the League of Nations, in 1920 to 1922. And once it says His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and it's enshrined in an international document, it then has international legitimacy. And if it was nothing else, it was the Zionists who were seeking international legitimacy. The Balfour Declaration in its own right is not a declaration that provides international legitimacy. And I will ask you just to remember Articles 2, 4, and 6. Those are the critical articles in the British Mandate for Palestine that will enable Zionists to immigrate, buy land, and establish an institution or institutions for themselves. What I'd like to do next is have you take a look at paragraphs 6, 7, and 8.
I assume that you all know how much land we can purchase in Eretz Israel in the next 10 years. The areas are as follows. In the south, 500,000 dunams. In Beit Shan Valley, despite the foreseeable difficulties, about 200,000 dunams. In the lowland and the Shomron, 150,000 dunmas. in Yehuda, 50,000 dunmas in the area east of the Jordan River, 1 million dunams on west side of the Jordan River in the Negev region. We have the possibility of purchasing 500,000 dunmas and an additional 500,000 dunams in various other locations.
My apologies. It should be dunams, a misspelling.
Everywhere, right?
Misspelling on my part. That's right. Now, if we take a look at the source is CZA, the Central Zionist Archives. It's the Karen Kayemet, that's the JNF. And the date is November 22nd, 1926. The author, Yehoshua Hankin, a very important real estate agent for the Zionists. Now, Hankin is making an estimate that there's a very high number of areas that are available for acquisition and purchase. He doesn't say we don't have the ability. He doesn't say we don't have the money, which they didn't. But he is making the statement that areas are available. Now, here's my first point. My first point is that when the Zionists came to Palestine, there were portions of Palestine that were totally unoccupied. There were portions of Palestine that were totally inhabited by segments of the Arab population of Palestine. To say that the Zionists came to Palestine, to an area that was totally unpopulated, is inaccurate. To say that they came to Palestine to an area that was totally occupied is also inaccurate. The point I want to make to you is Zionists understood where the lands were available. They knew that they had to purchase it. They knew it was going to be costly. And they knew that if they wanted to purchase it, they'd have to purchase it wherever it might be available, not necessarily where they wanted it. If you read paragraph 7, Palestine Arab newspapers from the 30s, tell me what you read, please, or please read it to us all.
Al-Jamaya, Al-Arabiya, 24 May 1934. The situation is unbearable, and our lands are now falling on easy prey into the hands of the raiders. The brokers are increasing every day among various classes of rich and poor people who have been dazzled by the Zionist gold. Al-Difa from November 5th, 1934. Is it human that the covetous Arab landowners should store capital to evict the peasant from his land and make him homeless or even sometimes a criminal? The frightened Arab who fears for his future today melts from fear when he imagines his offspring as homeless and as criminals who cannot look at the lands of their fathers.
Now, let me ask a question. If Arab newspapers in the 30s are recognizing that there's an issue about land sales, and they're writing about it in the newspapers, how serious might that situation be? The truth of the matter is, we know from the early 30s with the Arabic newspapers that Arab notables, editorial writers were very conscious of that land was passing out of the hands of Arab ownership into the hands of Jewish owners. And there was concern, worry. And as we would learn from 1936 to 39, there would actually be rebellion and violence, not so much against the Zionists, although there was plenty of animosity against the Zionists. But we know from the individuals who were killed in the Arab Rising of 36, 37, and 38, that many of the Arab notables who died were themselves individuals who had acted as land brokers or who had sold land directly to the Zionists. What I'm giving you is a slice. It's an ever so small slice. Take my word for it, and if you don't, I can show you as many documents as you want to indicate that Palestinian Arabs, the very essence of the Palestinian Arab national movement, the leaders of the Arab Executive, the Muslim Christian Association, the Mufti of Jerusalem's family, quietly and privately engaged in land sales to enhance their own private prestige and wealth at the hands of the good of what might be called the nation. I'm not sitting here in North Atlanta poking my finger at them for making a mistake. What I'm trying to indicate is that individuals made decisions along the course of history for which decisions cannot be reversed. You don't get a do-over as if you were playing stoop ball in Brooklyn and the little pink ball hit the stoop, then hit the milk truck and careened out of bounds, and you yelled do-over. That's why I said earlier the Zionists could not have done this if it were Coral Gables or Bedford, Massachusetts, or Dallas, Texas, or San Diego, California. They could only do it in an environment where there was a population that was willing to alienate their own lands without considering the major consequences of their action. That had nothing to do with Nazism. That had nothing to do with pogroms in Europe. That had nothing to do with World War I. And it had very little to do with the Balfour Declaration, because the land sales that began with the Arabs to the Jews began in the 1880s and the 1890s. Fully 1/4 of all the land that the Jews purchased from 1880 until 1917, 1/4 of all the land they purchased up until 1947, I didn't say 48, I said up until 47, up until partition, 1/4 was purchased before the Balfour Declaration was even written. Unmute yourself and read paragraph 8. Thank you.
Okay. In 1925, Sir Herbert Samuel said that large numbers of the Arab peasantry are exceedingly poor. In 1931, Chaim Arslarov, the head of the Jewish Agency, noted that the Bedouin of the South are on the threshold of starvation. In 1932, Moshe Smolansky, working for the Jewish Agency, remarked that in the Arab village, nauseating poverty prevails. Also in 1932, the director of the Palestine Department of Lands noted that the fellow rarely had clear title to his land and rarely had recourse to the formality of a regular mortgage, with perhaps not 5% of the fellow's land mortgaged formally. In 1935, though it was reported that many Falahin were appreciative of British efforts to establish agricultural credit, the great majority of them were in a state of depression. Remarks by Mr. Sidney Moody of the Palestine Administration, League of Nations Permanent Mandates Commission Minutes, 1937, the volume of the individual fellah's indebtedness represented the full value of his annual income from crops and agricultural stock, or in other words, his temporary wealth. Great Britain Palestine Royal Commission, Rural Indebtedness, memoranda prepared by the government of Palestine, 1937. In December 1939, the managing director of the Jewish National Fund, Abraham Granovsky, noted that the Arabs were in monetary distress due to indebtedness.
We have a second major economic reason for the making of the state. The first, Arab owners wishing to alienate their land, sell their land for monetary value. The second major reason is that there was an enormous economic depression sustained by the Arab peasants of Palestine from the end of World War I until the end of the 1940s. Palestine was a disaster zone during World War I. The Turks had destroyed it, laid it waste. The Arab peasantry really didn't recover from the reality that 60% of the olive crops were destroyed. In the early 1930s, a depression hit Palestine. In 36 to 39, there was an Arab revolt and rebellion against the Zionists, and that left the rural communities of the Palestinian Arabs in a treacherous state of affairs. It's important to understand that fully 90% of the Palestinian Arab population in the period from 1920 through 1948 were peasants. They lived a bare subsistence existence. So the economic depression that was due to local economic reasons, again, had nothing to do with pogroms, had nothing to do with Nazi Europe, had nothing to do with anything that was triggered or motivated by Zionists. It had to do with what the local economy was all about. Would you please read paragraph 10? Thank you.
1939, Arab leaders meeting in Damascus. Zionists have built a state. There is no boundary to the aspirations of the Zionists. If until September 1937, the Jews spoke about building a national home in Palestine, today they are already talking about the establishment of a Jewish state in part of Palestine. The Jewish community in Palestine has proven in the last 2 years of the uprising that they could defend themselves. There's no denial that the Jews had held up quite well in their confrontations with the Arab gangs on the roads, in the orchards, and in the agricultural settlements. There's no boundary to the aspirations of the Zionists. If until September 1937, the Jews spoke about building that's just repeating.
That's all right. I want you to.
If until September 1937, the Jews spoke about building a national home in Palestine, today they are already talking about the establishment of a Jewish state and part of Palestine. Remarks by Izzat Darwaza, Palestinian Arab political leader, September 30th, 1938.
The reason that it's repeated is I want you to take a look at the date. The date is September 37. It's 2 months after the British have suggested that Palestine be divided into an Arab and Jewish state, according to the Peel Commission report. It's 2 years before the British are going to suggest that Palestine be closed to the Zionists, either in land purchase or in immigration. It's almost 2 years before Hitler is going to invade Poland. Now, the reason I make this point about September 37 is I want you as teachers to consider the following. Consider the following, that events in Europe are tragic, horrendous, wrenching, cost the Jewish people half of its total. But the history of Europe is not the history of Palestine. They are not interconnected, except for the fact that in the early 30s, German Jewish immigrants and some Polish Jewish immigrants immigrated to Palestine. But the creation and the establishment of a nucleus for a Jewish state occurs historically almost independently of the absolute nastiness of European fascism. The two histories will overlap in the late 30s, into the early 40s, into the post-World War II period, into the period from 45 to 49, when 150,000 Jews come from displaced persons camp. The point I'm making again is asking the question, how did they make the state? And part of it has to do with an independent history or a semi-independent history. Granted, many Jews immigrated from Europe and they helped establish an infrastructure for a state. But you cannot say that it was European anti-Semitism that alone established the state of Israel or turned the Yishuv into the geographic nucleus for a state. Please read paragraph 11.
1939, Gershon Agronsky, Palestine economy undermined by disturbances. The almost uninterrupted disturbances, which the Arabs have kept going since April 1936, have reduced their economy to a parlous state. Although one of the motives of the promoters of the rebellion undoubtedly was to bring the Jewish community here to their knees by wrecking their economic life, it is doubtful if they thought far enough ahead to visualize the paralysis and decay which they were bound to inflict on their own people.
All right. I'm going to skip 12. I'm just going to briefly give you a synopsis of it. Michelle, just go back a little bit. The economic situation in the Arab sector had worsened throughout the years, and selling land became an economic lifesaver for them and for their families. Despite the growing fear, we were able to act aggressively during those years, though it required immense effort. Jewish National Fund. Now, the next paragraph deals with capital and finance. I'm not going to go through it. Suffice it to say that the Jews had access to capital, much of which they brought from Europe. Now you're going to see that European presence has an impact, or European Jewish engagement has an impact on the making of the state. Paragraph 14, if you'll stop right there, is important because in 1944, the British High Commissioner, Oliver Stanley, is suggesting that partition of Palestine is the only solution. Now, the British have suggested partition in 1937. They withdrew the idea in 1939. But again, in 1944, High Commissioner Stanley is putting his hand up and saying, the only solution is a two-state solution. The two-state solution is not something that just was born in the early 2000s as a result of several Israeli prime ministers and several Palestinian leaders saying, we'll take a two-state solution. Dividing the two populations goes back quite a ways. If you continue up to 15, please, Michelle. And 16, right there. Good.
September 1947, Arab League Secretary General Abdul Rahman Pasha, in conversation with Zionist John Kimchi, David Horowitz, and Abba Evan, Azam Pasha, the Arab world regards you as invaders and is ready to fight you. The conflict of interests among nations is, for the most part, not amenable to any settlement except armed clash. The Arab world is not in a compromising mood. It is likely, Mr. Horowitz, that your plan is rational and logical, but the fate of nations is not decided by rational logic. Nations never concede, they fight. You will not get anything by peaceful means or compromise. You can perhaps get something, but only by the force of arms. We shall try to defeat you. I am not sure we will succeed, but we will try. We were able to drive out the Crusaders, but on the other hand, we lost Spain and Persia. It may be that we shall lose Palestine, but it's too late to talk of peaceful solutions.
Okay. There was an awareness on the part of the Arab population of what was going on. There was an awareness on the part of the Jewish population of what was transpiring. There was an awareness on the part of the British of how the two communities were not getting along. I would maintain that the making of the Jewish state was a combination of factors that had to do with economics, politics, a Palestinian economy that was enormously weak, that an Arab political community that was dysfunctional and disunited. It is very difficult in a span of 50 minutes to provide you with information that each one of these paragraphs could be turned into easily a half an hour presentation. The purpose was to show you or to indicate to you or to reveal to you or to reinforce to you that our knowledge of the history of how Israel came into being isn't always made with great clarity. Sometimes it's made with contemporary politics and contemporary glasses overlaying what happened yesterday. I don't claim we have to go back to yesterday. I'm merely asking teachers and students to understand the whole story, to use the source materials, to unfold the story in a credible way. So one can't argue and say to you, oh, you only told us that part of the story, or you never told me that side of the story. I didn't choose to tell you one side or the other here. I used sources from every possible place I could get my hands on. And that's how the history is told. Not a narrative of one side or another, but the story of what transpired. I think as historians, we as teachers are obliged to tell our students the whole story. Not advocacy, but to teach them the story and to teach it from sources. Now, take a look at the next photo. This is a photo of May 1939. This is a photo of Ben-Gurion on the left, Chaim Weizmann in the center, and Eliezer Kaplan on the right. They are at the Zionist Congress of May of 1939. At that Zionist Congress of 1939, they are aware of the fascism that's emerging in Europe. They are fully aware that the British are going to close Palestine to Jewish immigration and land purchase. These are three individuals who are leaders of the Zionist movement, but have great consternation on their mind, great worry about what is happening and what will happen. Let me submit to you, don't go there yet, Michelle. Let me submit to you that within 40 years, you're going to see an entirely different photograph of Zionist leaders making an entirely different decision. This May of 39 is with Jews without self-determination. This is 39 without Jews determining their own future. This is Jews where they are the subject of someone else's sentence. Michelle, the next photograph, please. This is the Israeli Knesset in September of 78. Shimon Peres at the top, Yigal Allon next to him, with Abba Eban on the right. The bottom row, Simcha Ehrlich, Menachem Begin, Ezer Weizmann, and Yagal Yadin has his head back to us. These 7 gentlemen are deciding, should they or should they not accept the recommendations of Menachem Begin after he came back from Camp David to ultimately sign a peace treaty with the Egyptians. My point is, one is without self-determination and the other is with. I would argue to you that the Zionists up to 39 and up to 47 and 48 were still in the process of gaining self-determination. They were still in the process of learning what political and economic and military strength was all about. The story of Israel is the story of Jews taking destiny into their own hands, to exercising choice, to engaging with history, and then to making decisions for themselves. Next, please, Michelle. So here are the elements in the making of the state. There are 5 bullet points here. I'm going to hasten to finish because we've run out of time. Michelle, the next slide, please. These are another 11 total elements in making the state. These are all conclusions that you could take from the text study if you desire to do so. What essentially I've done is I've tried hard to condense the story into an hour and give you enough information that you can move with clarity, with honesty, with the use of the sources in telling the story to your students to whatever degree you think you want to tell them and to whatever detail you prefer. For each of the URLs that are mentioned in this PowerPoint are on our website. And each of those documents has a lengthy introduction. And you can just take those lengthy introductions and use them as your sources for your presentations, for your flipped classroom, for discussion sections, for breakout rooms, for any number of the tools which were talked about earlier today. My apologies to you all for having to hasten you through it, to move quickly through it. I wanted to model it. I wanted to provide the sources to you. I wanted to show you how you could gain access to it yourself, how you could tell the whole story and not portions of the story, and allow your students to inquire further without dwelling on advocacy or dwelling on a narrative, but teaching the history.